On his returning to England, Rob Hopkins helped to create an energy descent plan in Totnes, Devon, the first transition town. Others soon followed. Lewes, Glastonbury and Stroud are full of middle-class hippie types, but in Bristol it's the poorer districts that have been most dynamic, and across Wales the impetus has largely come from the agricultural community. Today, there are more than 150 official groups who have formally asked to join the network, and hundreds of others still preparing or mulling it over. There are now transition towns in New Zealand, Canada, and the US. After first talking to Hopkins 2 years ago, I registered my own corner of northwest London on the Transition Town website and hoped that someone would join me. Nothing happened. So I cycled to South London to meet Duncan Law, an actor and director, who parked the day job many, many months ago to devote himself full-time to launching Transition Town Brixton. The cafe where we met, Honest Foods, had a policy of sourcing food locally. Law asked for a word with a chef, said he knew someone with a vast crop of pears in their garden, and asked if the chef would be interested in buying them. Without hesitation, the chef said yes. I was impressed. Law took me on a tour of Brixton, him on his recumbent bike, and me on my foldaway with tiny wheels. If we looked odd together, the effect was increased by Law stopping every so often to collect apples that had fallen from trees. He told me about an entrepreneur who made £4,000 in the early 1950s, more than Law's headmaster father earned in a year, by commissioning children to gather blackberries for him. Transition Town Brixton, he said, was about to start mapping fruit trees across South London. They've since done that. Near Balham, we visited Sue Sheehan, a Transition Town supporter, who recently started growing fruit and veg in boxes in a tiny space in front of her terraced house. I still hadn't got the hang of how to be upbeat about peak oil and climate change, and ungraciously told her that the crop, though plentiful, would not be enough to keep her alive when the trouble starts. But every lettuce you grow yourself, Law said, saves growing another 1 miles away and shipping it to you, and all the emissions associated with that. A few days later, I watched The Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil, a documentary film about what happened to Cuba after Soviet oil supplies dried up. It shows how Cubans gradually turned away from a heavy reliance on carbon-intensive agriculture. In rural areas, they learned to plough with oxen. In cities, all kinds of spaces were turned to horticulture, from window boxes to wasteland. The transition took more than 2 years, and Cubans had to forego the equivalent of a meal a day. But by the end, even people in cities were producing half their annual fruit and vegetable needs. I finally found like-minded people nearer my home, willing to launch a transition town. In Belside's library, we hosted a week of film screenings, culminating with The Power of Community. It was clear from the question and answer session afterwards that the audience was gagging to start growing food. Strangely, they just seemed to want some kind of permission to get started. I improvised. Just go for it. What can you lose? Transition Belsize was born, and I found myself coordinating the 40-strong food group. The first thing the group did was visit my allotment. My new friends weeded, built a new raised bed, and took some of my surplus apples. Since then, we have gathered names of people on the waiting list for allotments and put them in touch with householders who possess gardens but insufficient time, expertise, and ability to grow food themselves. We'd set up a section in the local library with books and magazines devoted to food growing, coordinated bulk purchasing of otherwise costly organic food so a wider portion of the population can access it, and got agreement from the local franchisor Budgeons to sell produce grown by local people in gardens and allotments. In the Transition Handbook, published last year, and already reprinted several times, Rob Hopkins offers what he calls a cheerful disclaimer. Just in case you were under the impression that transition is a process defined by people who have all the answers, you need to be aware of a key fact. We truly don't know if this will work. Transition is a social experiment on a massive scale. What we're convinced of is this. A. If we wait for the government, it'll be too little, too late. B. If we act as individuals, it will be too little. But C. If we act as communities, it might just be enough just in time.